Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. This is your host, Emily Gross, and I am so excited to have with me today Ted Gerber. Ted is the director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, and the director of the Wisconsin Russia Project at the University of Wisconsin Madison. How are you doing today, Ted?
Well, pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we are Yeah. So I did an episode on Russia and Ukraine last week. We're going to do another one with new updates. All about what the fuck is going on because it is crazy. It is so upsetting to watch. And I think it's really important that we kind of take another peek to see what the new developments are. So I just want to let people know that I will be drinking a lot and probably saying what the fuck over and over again. And Ted's going to be taking the lead on answering the importance of all my questions. Before we start, Ted, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking red wine, actually, Napa Valley Cabernet.
Ooh, lovely. I have a beer called Alexander. I specifically went to a specialty beer shop to look for a Ukrainian beer. However, they did not have one. And then I was looking, was like, all right, what else? What other country used to be part of the Soviet bloc and has successfully maintained their resistance? And I was like, all right, let's look for a Czech beer. And they did not have a Czech beer, but they had a Czech style beer. And that is what I'm drinking today.
They didn't have Pilsner Urquell. That's a great beer
Yeah,
from
it's a good
Nice
one,
spot.
and but unfortunately, I didn't have it. It was one of those like really bougie beer shops where a beer is like $20. It's ridiculous. Anyways,
That's
all
pretty
right,
ridiculous.
so let's start. What the fuck?
It's
We had
great.
seen this
Yeah.
kind of building up for so long, and then overnight, it feels like it just absolutely exploded. What's going on?
I know. I mean, so yes, it's built up for a long time. I mean, apart from the recent troop buildup, when that started to get attention in December, it actually goes back. There was another troop buildup around Ukraine back in the spring, and so that already should have caused some alarm. Putin has taken various measures in the last year that also, really pointed toward this, such as giving passports, Russian passports, to the residents of those two breakaway republics, the DNR and the LNR, or Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as they refer to themselves. And they did things like banning Ukrainian language in the schools in those republics. The leaders of those republics joined Putin's party in Russia. Other clear steps. Nonetheless, in the recent run up, I was actually surprised at how much skepticism there was among, in many different circles. If anything, I think maybe Western kind of, professor types, academics, Russian observers were more concerned about actual invasion than it seemed. The Ukrainians themselves, and then certainly the Russian scholars were didn't really think. They thought that this would be just a big bluff by Putin. I think people started to take it more seriously actually when the U.S. started to reveal these intelligence reports about how Russia had planned these false flag operations, these diversions, and then, last Friday when Biden made his speech saying that Russia's going to attack, they're going to attack Ukraine, they're familiar with all their battle plans. I mean, that really got my attention because I thought the U.S. president was not, lay that out if he didn't have really, really strong intelligence suggesting that would happen. And despite all this, despite the fact that we all expected this to happen, it's just devastating. It's absolutely shocking.
It's
I mean,
awful.
it's awful to see, this big, strong country attack another country, its neighbor, which hasn't done anything. I mean, it's just absurd to think that Ukraine in any way threatens Russia, and so it just seems like an all out, one party is the aggressor. To me, there's no gray area here. It's just,
No.
and really also, I think it's Putin. It's Putin's war. It's not really Russia's war
Right.
against Ukraine. I mean, we've actually had some debates among colleagues about whether we should call it Russia's war or Putin's war. But I fall down very firmly on the Putin side. I think this is just one man who has absolute authority within Russia. I mean, it's really one single man is making the decision to go to war here. And for his own reasons, which are not very transparent, to put it mildly, he decided to attack, and he's completely indifferent to all the suffering this is causing.
Yeah.
I think it's incredibly foolish on his part too. I think he's making a huge mistake. I think this is actually going to bring him down. I think this is the
Really?
end of the line. Yeah, I do. I do. I mean, maybe
How
not
do you
everyone
think he'd
agrees.
be brought down though? Because it feels like he has such a stronghold over his country, you know?
Well, I think he does have a stronghold over his country for a number of reasons. Mainly that he's been able to really terrify most of the people and eliminate any potential alternative leaders. But he's really, if you look at the pattern in the recent years, he's really cracked down quite severely. So
Right.
he's been in power about 20 years. But in the last year and a half, we've seen him try to poison his main rival, using this internationally banned chemical substance, Novichok. Passed a raft of laws that make it very easy for the authorities to arrest anyone who they dislike for any reason, pretty much. He has actually implemented those laws, and he's increased the penalties for things like showing up at a protest. Even, you hear things about, people posting on Facebook about a protest, or even just putting a picture of a protest, and that's enough to get them kicked out of university, sometimes fined under these very vaguely worded laws. So he's acting like a man who's scared. He's acting like a man who's really afraid. There's lots of problems in Russia domestically. The Russian economy is really stagnated and in fact, even shrunk, and people's wages have declined in real value. I mean, think about it this way. Moscow is just as expensive a city as New York, with which you're familiar. But the average wage in Russia is $500 a month. Now, who's going
Wow.
to live on $500 in Moscow? Okay, so I mean, wages are higher in Moscow than the average, but still, that just gives you a sense of just how much of a struggle it is for many Russians to get by. COVID has been a massive problem in Russia, and they've done their best to try to hide the scope of the problem, to try to pretend that they were dealing with it.
Which feels a lot like Putin does, is he's just like, no, 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 everything's fine. Yeah, no. He feels just like a
Absolutely,
terrible magician. Very, very bad at hiding
that's a
what
good way
he's
to put
doing.
it. Yeah, I mean, he sort of lives by the credo, it seems, of like make them stop me. He's just going to keep on pushing the envelope and trying to get away with whatever he can until someone actually puts a stop to it. And so, I mean, I personally estimate, the actual percentage of Russians who totally adore Putin and love him is really not that high, maybe 20%. The rest of the supporters are people who just don't know any alternative. They just feel it's easier to just go along with the flow. I really think that for Russians, making war, attacking Ukraine is a very traumatic action, which is going to upset them. I mean, a lot of them, they have family in Ukraine, they're
Yeah, I
from
mean, there's
Ukraine.
been a lot of protests going on, a lot of anti-war protests in Russia as well, where I don't know if you've been on social media a lot, but on Twitter, I mean, being brutalized and arrested, elderly people being arrested for protesting this war. And I really want to kind of put the focus on Ukraine so people really know the atrocities that are going on right now. Can you elaborate on what Ukraine is seeing from Russia about how they're being attacked, the casualties, what's going on? I know there's a lot of stuff going on in Kyiv that's really, really scary. So if you could just kind of give the listeners an overview of the attack, that'd be great.
There was a lot of uncertainty about how far Putin was going to go. I mean, we were pretty sure he was going to attack, but we thought maybe he would limit himself to those, eastern regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, where they've had Russia's backed secessionist rebels for a while. Um, and so I was personally shocked when Biden said last Friday, "Oh, he's going to go all the way to Kiev," and it turns
Right.
out that that is indeed what he's done. So
Unfortunately.
it's an all-out attack. So far, it looks like Russia has been targeting mainly military targets. So they've attacked, some airports, but mainly they've gone after command and control posts. But they've had air attacks, missile attacks. There's tanks. There's actually armed forces. We don't really know. We don't have good coverage of what's going on in these engagements, but it does seem a few things do seem clear. So yes, I mean there have been some civilian deaths, although thus far we haven't seen like wanton civilian directed attacks, as in bombing, residential neighborhoods or things like that.
I did see there was some rumors going around that he was attacking hospitals.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a fog of war type of situation. I would
Yeah.
caution before jumping into any conclusions. I'm not denying that that happened, but I do know that in any war, both sides are going to put out stories about atrocities, and as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I have seen, I've not seen confirmation that they directly targeted hospitals. So early, before the war actually started, there was an incident where the rebels blew up a hospital and a school, and that near that the boundary of that held territory. But since the actual Russian military engagement has begun, although there have been some, some missiles have gone astray and destroyed buildings, some things have been shot down, and I don't mean to minimize. I mean, the suffering that the Ukrainians are enduring is really unspeakable right now, and just the
Right.
fear, the terror, and civilians are being killed, and they're looking at the prospect of their country being occupied by a foreign army. So my understanding, and again, now I'm limited to communication with friends in Ukraine and so forth, but they're not out on the battlefield. So it seems like most of the military assault is happening on battlefields. It is military against military. It also seems like the attack is not going as quickly as Putin had hoped. So it seems like they're in Kiev now. There's a big battle in Kiev. It doesn't look good for the Ukrainian side. They're just overmatched. They're really showing a lot of bravery and courage in fighting. I mean,
It's crazy. I saw that there's martial law enacted now, and literally, President Zelensky, right? Um,
yeah,
he's out there as well, and every Ukrainian who wants a weapon or wants arms and wants to fight is encouraged to do so. So I think we can all commend the bravery of the Ukrainians for
that's right. And
defending.
I put myself in their shoes. I'm like, well, what would I do? Like, would I
No
really go
idea.
out and risk my life, and go out and start shooting at tanks, which is a
Right.
hopeless cause? It really is remarkable. I mean, there was this incident of that island, in the Black
I saw
Sea,
that.
where those 13 brave border patrol people, they knew they were going to get destroyed, and they were, but they were defiant, and they basically told the Russian ship to go fuck itself. They were warned to abandon,
Yeah.
and things like that. That just testifies like how much the Ukrainians do not want to be subjugated by Russia. They do not want to be taken over by Russia. What I fear is that things are going to get worse before they get better. Like,
Yeah.
so I admire the bravery. I of course think it's great that Ukraine is fighting back, but you just worry that Russia will just escalate and escalate and escalate its force until they start targeting civilians, till they start causing. I mean, we could be looking at a street battle in Kiev, as we speak, and that is going to cause a lot more casualties than we've seen already. A lot more devastation, and it's just tragic
It's
to
it's
see.
terrible. It is absolutely obscene to be watching on TV.
It is obscene, and I think I mean, people laugh as, oh, Trump, he said Putin's a genius for recognizing these republics. Ha ha ha. This is not a joke. This is not funny. And I'll lay bare my own views. I mean, he should be ashamed. I mean, he should be ashamed for many things, but he should certainly be ashamed for justifying an action which is resulting in wanton slaughter of innocent people. I mean, how dare he? How could anyone be so inhumane, just so indifferent to human life, just to kind of laugh at? Oh, what a genius! I see all these army tanks, very funny. I mean, and that I just find deeply
No.
offensive. I
They're
also
all
think,
evil asshats is my specific scientific term for them.
yeah, that's
Is
a
an
good
evil
evil
asshat.
assets. I like that. That's a good way to put it. Right,
Yeah.
right.
So let's talk about what rationale Putin is giving for this invasion. Also, whatever he is saying is horseshit. However, let's
Yeah,
dive into what it,
other
because I've seen a
horseshit.
lot of things going around where he's wants to liberate Ukraine from Nazis, and Zelensky's like, "Yo, I'm Jewish," which makes
Mhm.
no sense. Talking about there's been a lot of issues like surrounding NATO. There's been he wants to talking about overthrowing the government and electing them an actually democratic government. And I'm doing air quotes because this is actually an elected democratic government in Ukraine at the moment.
Yes,
So
yes, it
let's
is.
talk about what is Putin saying? What is his rationale?
Well, his argument seems to have shifted a bit, but I mean, okay, so we'll get to the neo-Nazi part. So initially, he gathered all these troops around Ukraine, with a clear threat, like, guess what we're going to do? We have all these troops aligned in battle formation, 150, 190,000, and he made these demands to the United States, saying that the United States has to withdraw all of its troops from Europe. It has to agree, or NATO has to agree, but Putin thinks that NATO is just the United States. Like, he just thinks that it's silly to pretend that the other countries of NATO have any say whatsoever. That, I mean, and whether or not that's true, that's how he sees it. So he wanted the United States to withdraw its troops from Europe, to guarantee that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, and also to withdraw, to reduce troops and so forth, particularly in those new member nations of NATO, the former Soviet republics in the Baltics and Eastern Europe. So that was his initial demands, and they presented those. And we had to know that the U.S. was not going to accept that. I mean,
Right.
so then he shifted the rationale to this idea of anti-Russian neo-Nazi fascist running Ukraine. And that argument actually goes back to 2014. Like that's exactly the same kind of rhetoric that Putin and his cronies used and that the pro-state Russian television used. I mean, they had all these fake stories about Ukrainian fascists crucifying Russian children. And he actually argues that the Ukrainian state was committing genocide against the Russian citizens, whom Putin himself made citizens, and there is no genocide. But it is an interesting ploy, and because it actually comes back to this narrative that Putin has really tried to bolster throughout his regime about World War II being this glorious sacred achievement, and the whole world should be forever grateful to Russia for its great victory over the Nazis. And any attempt to challenge that narrative about how Russia single-handedly maybe had a little bit of help from the Allies, and to be fair, Russia did bear the brunt of the casualties, or the Soviet Union did anyway.
Right.
But so he tries to link up this idea of Nazis, which is absolutely fabricated and fanciful. I'm saying that Nazis and fascists and what the Russians call banderas. So Stepan Bandera was this extreme Ukrainian nationalist who fought against the Soviets after the end of the Second World War, and he was also an anti-Semite, and so the Russians, they label Ukrainians who they don't like as Banderas. I can't believe that Putin thinks anybody in the world outside of Russia believes for a second
Yeah.
that Ukraine is run by neo Nazis. It's really directed towards his own people. It just shows how desperate he is to try to
Right.
justify this, but I just don't think it's going to work. I think Russians, they know, they travel to Ukraine, they have relatives in Ukraine, the Ukrainians come to Russia, they know what that country is like. They can't possibly think that it's crawling with neo Nazis
And
or
I
it's
think that's
governed
what
by.
Zelensky said as well, because when he did a speech to Ukrainians and Russians and spoke in both languages and was like, this is the real Ukraine, like what propaganda you've been seeing is not true. This is who we really are, and we're your neighbors. So stop. Like,
That's right.
let's be
And he
done.
posted that. He did that. If I'm not mistaken, he transmitted that on Facebook, and so
Right.
perhaps not surprisingly, it looks like Russia is going to shut down Facebook. They'll probably do it over the weekend,
Wow.
and that's consistent with what I think Putin is trying to do. So, and here again, I depart from the international relations theorists and the strategists and the analysts who say, "Oh, Russia this, Russia that." This is not about Russia. This is not about Russia's interests versus the West.
No.
You have people in the West who say, "Oh, it's all the West's fault. We shouldn't have allowed NATO to expand. The Russians have legitimate grievances." There might be some room for discussion of that, but let's be realistic. This is Putin. This is one single man making the decision to go to war. It's not the Russian people. It's not even like the Russian elites, the Russian government. They're all terrified of Putin.
How do we get him out of office? How does this happen? I know, let's talk about the sanctions and how the entire world's responding, especially focused on the US, because that's where we're in right now. How is the world responding to this? How are we going to stop this?
Well, I hate to say this, but I think the only answer is the Russian people have to overthrow him. They have to cause enough disorder in the country. It has to go beyond just strikes. They have to go out in mass protests. They have to create a perception of instability within Russia so that the elite oligarchs, who perhaps do have the means, I mean, the people are powerless against Putin on their own. They really need the support of some elites, and so Putin has stayed in power largely by creating this image of himself as the one person among the elite who has the popularity, who has the legitimacy of the population. So if you can crack that veneer of or that appearance of support, you could quickly have a cascade of defections, as the political scientists might call it, among the elites, where one person says, "Okay, I'm not going to do this." The thing is, it's very risky for any one elite to stick their necks out and say,
Oh, because
"Okay,
they're going to get killed
they're going to kill."
immediately.
Exactly. They're going to
Yeah.
lose. They're going to get killed very fast, perhaps in a very painful way.
Right.
And so they try. So the key is to get make the situation so bad that enough of them they start to try to band together and say, all right, enough of this. We can't take this anymore. And so I think the sanctions are designed both to make the economy much worse in Russia, both to I mean it's going to hurt the Russian people.
Which is just
Uh,
so upsetting to know that one person's just ego tyrant is hurting millions and millions and millions of people.
That's right. It shouldn't happen in the 21st century. It really
No.
shouldn't. I mean, it shouldn't. If humanity, I mean, we've had tyrants in history. We've had tyrants, is of course, but we've had. But you would think that, given modern means of communication and modern political institutions and so forth, it's very discouraging to think that you have a country of the nature of Russia, which has a vast nuclear arsenal, which has all this oil and natural gas, all this power, is really come down to rule by one man. It
It's
really is a pure
crazy.
one dictatorship. It's crazy. Like, none of the institutions matter. It took a while to get here. Like, when Putin first came to power, it wasn't like that. Russia had some nascent institutions. It had a legislative body that was meaningful, at least a little bit. It had a judiciary that occasionally would go against the ruling party. But Putin, he has a small circle of friends and cronies who also have participated in his actions. And it's extremely corrupt too. It really is like a mafia state. I mean, these guys are among the richest people in the world. Russia is a remarkably rich country. Its people live miserable lives because so much of the money is just stolen by a narrow group of elites. So I think this action in Ukraine, I think this was a huge blunder. I really think he has miscalculated. So first of all, I think the way he understood it, like, this was going to work out well for him, and I think he was worried about,
He's
of
fucking
course,
delusional.
yeah, yeah, he is definitely
Truly.
delusional.
This is why you need friends in your life who will actually tell you the truth about what's going on. You know?
Yeah,
You need
that's
friends who will tell you have food in your teeth, okay? And he does not have those people. Right.
No, you're absolutely right, and that is a key. So that's a key argument in favor of democratic institutions that political scientists make. You hit it in a nutshell. I mean, they don't quite use that language, but they should. I mean, because that makes it really clear. It's a very
Yeah.
simple argument, and that is, the problem with these authoritarian systems is the leader doesn't ever get any real feedback. So when there are problems, he doesn't realize, and it's too late, and he starts to believe. I mean, I should use gender neutral, he or she, but I don't know. I don't know any like vicious, brutal dictators over the
Yes,
years who went
exactly. No, there are, because this is a man thing, you know? I've seen
It's
a tweet that was like, if only the men who rule the world went to therapy, this would not happen, and it could not be more true. Okay?
I think, yeah. I mean, they should be required to at least smoke some weed and
Do something.
do something,
Truly.
whatever it takes.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh my god.
yeah. So I think
Anyways,
we're in
yeah.
that situation where maybe he's just been so everybody's so terrified to challenge him in any way, and he starts to believe it. And maybe he really believes that the Ukrainians are desperate for Russia to come in and save them. Maybe he really thought the army would just lay down its arms and let him come in and execute their president and put somebody else in charge. It just seems absurd that he would think that, but all everything he's doing just seems absurd. It's
It's
just
all absurd.
because
Yeah.
this is gonna hurt. Like, there's no positive result out of this for Putin, for Russia.
For Ukraine,
It-
there's nothing. There is
yeah,
no good that's coming from this.
there's no silver lining. I mean, okay, I suppose, with the slight possible exception, this has reunified. So two things. I think if you're looking for silver lining from the U.S. perspective, like, it is very helpful for reunifying NATO and starting to undo a lot of the damage that Trump did. I mean,
Yeah.
Biden's been working on that. But hey, let's face it, America has benefited from being at the top of this big alliance that has preserved peace in Europe, had a basic security structure in Europe, and that has provided assistance to U.S. in its foreign conflicts. And the whole Trump project of trying to dismantle NATO and blow it up, I mean, who knows if it was because he's so beholden to Putin he tried to do that, but he did try to do that. And so this has totally reversed that. So already we see Putin has achieved absolutely the opposite of what he said he set out to do. He wanted NATO to become weaker, to fewer U.S. troops in Europe, less unity. But instead, the exact opposite has happened. That the NATO alliance has come together so far, anyway, and there's more U.S. troops going to Russia. There's more resolve. The other thing is, I think if you look at the U.S. politics side of it, apart from a few, what did you call them before? I think
Oh,
the
evil ass hats. Yeah.
Eva asshats like Carlson and Trump, and now Tulsi Gabbard. She's the latest
Oh, yeah.
to.
What the fuck, Tulsi? Sorry.
I don't know.
Anyway,
I don't know.
all right.
I really don't know what happened with that. It's just I think she must be on the payroll
She has
of
to
the
be. There's no
FSB.
other way.
Yeah, exactly. She's a total asshat. Actually. So, but I really think this is kind of a fringe position. I really don't think, apart from them, it seems the Republicans can't decide whether Biden's being too strong or too weak. So,
He, I
the Trump.
personally, I personally feel like he's not being strong enough, which I want to pick your brain about. So we've enacted a lot of sanctions, mainly in the tech world and also like against the oligarchs, stuff like that. However,
Banks.
a big things that I've noticed that we're not enacting sanctions are oil and gas. And oil and gas count for 40% of Russia's exports. So that's a really, really big thing to not be doing. And I understand that enacting those sanctions would have a big effect on America at home. Wanted to kind of get your thoughts. Do you think Biden will enact those sanctions on oil and gas? Do you think that's kind of like, I feel like that might be one of the best ways to stop Putin?
Yeah, I mean, some of the tech export sanctions do affect the oil and gas industry. I mean, Russian oil and gas industry doesn't really have its own. Relies on imports for a lot of its technology, but that's not an immediate thing. So what would hurt that is SWIFT. So SWIFT would basically make it impossible for Russia to export anything and get paid for it.
For people who don't know what Swift is, Ted, would you tell them?
It's a Belgian created system whereby banks communicate with each other. So it replaced the old telex system. And basically, what SWIFT is, there's about 11,000, I think, banks that are members of this SWIFT. It's an acronym, and
It's
for
an
people who
international banking system,
yeah,
and
it's
yeah,
international banking system, which basically without that, so banks have all come to rely on it. So without that, when you transfer your money, you do some work in Germany, they send you money through a wire transfer. Well, that goes through the SWIFT system. Without the SWIFT system, there's no way for the banks to know where that money's coming from, where it's going. So that basically puts an end to wire transactions. And without those, then you're relying on checks and cash, and there's no way for major international commerce to work. A Russian economist named Kudrin, he estimated that ending SWIFT or cutting Russia out of SWIFT would reduce their economy by 5%. It would hurt their growth by 5% in the next year. So I think if you have a Russian economist who's a good economist as well as being a politician say that, it's going to really take a big bite. So I guess
do you think they're going to be kicked out of Swift? And by the way, people, a lot of the international community is calling for Russia to be kicked out of Swift, as it's kind of one of the bigger sanctions that could happen
yes.
in response. So, do you think that's
Yes,
going to
I think
happen?
this. I think the stumbling block is Germany. I think Germany, which is particularly reliant on oil and gas imports. I mean, the U.S. gets a little bit of its energy supplies from Russia, not that much though. Germany, I think, as estimated, gets 30% of its gas. So
Wow,
if you cut those supplies, particularly in wintertime, that's really going to drive up prices there. It's going to cause shortages. It's going to be a real problem. But also, it's going to impede the German companies hamper their ability to make money. So the EU in general has much more trade with Russia than the U.S. I really don't think these sanctions, even the oil and gas, it's not going to hurt Americans that much. Like prices are already going up, inflation's already high, the war is already going to create uncertainty in markets and there'll be profiteering and so forth, speculation. So I think the additional impact of sanctions is very minimal. Actually, it's kind of overblown. It's much more consequential for Europe, and that's why I think it's particularly the Europeans who are balking at kicking Russia out of SWIFT. Now, I think if Kiev falls, I think if we see something like the execution of Ukrainian leaders, then I think you're going to see SWIFT revoked. I think the Europeans are trying to hold out in the hope that maybe Russia won't go the next step. But I would predict that yes, SWIFT, and I also think they're going to sanction Putin personally, and that would be a big step. I don't know that we've seen that in recent years where individual leaders of a country, a head of state, is actually sanctioned by the U.S. And I don't know how much of an impact. It's probably more symbolic. I'm sure Putin is
right?
so rich. Some think he's the richest guy in the world. He
Is he
has that big.
really?
Well, have you seen this YouTube video of his mansion in the Black Sea? Like you should watch it if you have. You should because it's remarkable. You've never seen any luxury like that. So
I
this
have
is the one
I
where
I hate a lot of people from high school, but I don't think I've ever hated someone more than Putin at the moment.
yeah, he's really despicable. I mean, he really goes
Just
down as
yeah,
one of the
it's
most odious
awful.
people in history. And this is, I mean, this Ukrainian, I already felt that way about him, but now I think this Ukrainian, like he's going to go down in history, not only as one of the most horrible and evil and just vicious, cruel, selfish leaders we've ever seen, along the likes of Hitler and Stalin, but also as a colossal failure, because this is a huge blunder.
Interesting. So where do you see the international community going next? Because all these sanctions are starting. So where, but it hasn't stopped, and Putin is still ravishing
Yeah,
Ukraine.
I
So
don't think it's going to stop. He's going to continue his mission. I mean, although so today I
yeah,
guess there's been some discussions of maybe opening negotiations, and Russia has suffered some casualties. They've shot down some planes, they've destroyed some Russian tanks. Those Javelin missiles, remember those missiles that Trump didn't want to give Zelensky until he agreed to help him like frame Hunter
Oh,
Biden?
was that what that was
Those,
about?
yeah, that's what Javelin missiles,
All right.
and
So Trump
those
is
are.
literally on his knees to Putin. So, all
Yeah,
right.
Trump is literally on his knees and bent over, or whatever,
Yeah,
whatever
whatever, asking for more. Who
metaphor
knows?
you want to. Yeah, probably both at the same time. Yeah. Yeah, no, he really was really a suck up and a kiss ass and everything, and it's pathetic. How can these people hear Trump, suck up, lick the asshole of this guy
Yeah.
Putin, who's such a butcher, and think that's okay? I mean, I just don't get it. It's just crazy. It's
Yeah.
just crazy.
It's brainwashing and distrust in just the entire world is so upsetting. It's
So
fine.
okay, but back to your question, like I don't think this is going to end soon. I mean, I don't think Putin is just going to pack up and go and leave. I mean, I think
He's on a
he made a
mission.
decision that he's taking this to the bitter end, and so
Yeah.
they'll keep fighting. They'll just keep escalating. Like they have the personnel and the equipment to prevail. I mean, I think what they try to do so far is make it kind of a more surgical attack, where they're just engaging Ukrainian forces. They were in the hope that maybe Ukraine's army would capitulate and they wouldn't get much resistance. That's proven not to be the case, but I don't think that leads to them retreating. I think it will lead to an escalation. So I think we're going to see a lot more carnage
I,
in the coming days. And then what? I mean, what's he going to do then? I mean, so all
yeah.
right, is he going to install a puppet regime? Is he going to annex all of Ukraine and say now it's part of Russia? I mean, and enslave the people? I mean, look, these people are willing to die in the name of their freedom. They're not going to just
I know.
happily accept whoever Putin puts in there. It's just
Yeah.
not. It's not in the cards. So.
That is
Um,
so upsetting.
yeah,
So,
yeah, it is. And I mean, I'm glad you're covering this because I think for Americans, I mean, let's face it. There's lots of horrible things happening all over the world. There's
right.
lots of there's wars in Africa. There's frozen conflicts. There's guerrilla. There's right wing states, authoritarian dictators that massacre their people all throughout the world. But this somehow, the scale of it, amount of weaponry that is being deployed against Ukraine, is just beyond comparison. The
Yeah.
scale, we have many Ukrainians and Russians living in our midst. And by the way, I also want to make the point every Russian I know, and I know a number of them, many of them are in the US, a lot of them are in Russia. They're as upset by this as you and I are. So this is really like
Absolutely.
they're just shocked. Like imagine how we would feel if the U.S. started to bomb Montreal and Ottawa and
Ex-
Toronto.
exactly. I think that's why it feels so shocking to all of us. We're like, what the, like, how is this
Yeah,
happening?
what? Yeah, right. Yeah, it's
And I
completely.
actually learned yesterday from my mom that I'm of Ukrainian heritage, which I had no idea. I thought
There you
we were
go.
Russian, because all Jews from the old country are all from that part of the area. And I always thought we were Russian. My mom was like, no, like your great grandfather was from Kiev. And I was like, who told me? you
There you
know, like it's
go.
why it just feels so close to home because people have so many ties to
Yeah,
this country.
so many times,
Yeah.
and
So where do we go from here? How do we help Ukraine? How do we put an end to this carnage?
well, I mean, there's been talk of arming an insurgency, and I mean, I think depending on how things pan out, that is certainly one thing that can be done. We have to make it, we meaning the international community, the United States, should make it painful for the Russians to occupy this country and
Right.
impose their will. We have to keep the costs high so that it puts more pressure on Putin. We have to maintain our unity, maintain the sanctions. I mean, the fear is that all right, this is in the news now, but then Russia will take over, and then gradually people will forget about
Exactly. Which
our
is
allies will start to peel
always the
off.
fear with these types of situations is it gets news coverage and then all of a sudden the news cycle forgets about these people and these people are still going through it. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean they're not still going through it on a day-by-day basis.
That's right. And I also think, we should embark in an all-out campaign to try to turn the Russian people against Putin. Now, Putin has
Yeah.
accused us of doing that before, and maybe there was a little bit of that,
Yeah.
honestly, in the past. But
Sneaky
I don't
sneaky.
think it was effective, and I don't think, we had to be creative. I mean,
Right.
I think, so one concrete thing we can do is, and this sounds counterintuitive, but I think we should open our borders and we should invite any Russian who wants to come to the U.S. and work in the U.S. Now we should vet them for security reasons. We don't want like spies and plans. So I think Russia has a lot of very talented people. It needs its talented people. If we can attract their talented people to come here, leave Russia. Instead, the U.S. government has done the opposite. They made it almost impossible for Russians to get visas, and that just makes no sense to me.
Right.
It makes no sense. We should be doing the opposite. I think if we believe that our way, our institutions are preferable to Putin's, dictatorship, then let the Russians see for themselves. Bring them over here. Let them work here. Let them contribute to our society. Let them, get educated in our institutions. Let them, and they're not all going to love us. They're not, a lot of them. And then the United States is far from perfect. There's lots of problems here, as
Yeah.
I'm sure you know.
Oh yeah.
But I think by and large, it would be one very easy thing to do would be to make it a lot easier for Russians and also Ukrainians. I mean, we should. So that's another thing we have to do is we really have to support Poland because that's where most of them are going to go
Interesting.
in terms of accommodating the refugees who are going to leave Ukraine and flee. We have to do what we can to prop up, sort of a shadow government so that Ukrainians have a leader, kind of government, perhaps housed in Poland, that can make policy, that can coordinate efforts to oppose the Russian forces. So I think there are, we can do all those things. The most important thing is the alliance has to stick together.
I have two questions I want to pick your brain about. Um, First one is NATO. So I saw NATO for the first time ever enacted their defense forces, which I think it sends about 40,000 troops into the surrounding areas. Do you think there's a world in which America actually sends troops into Ukraine?
No, I
No.
think that's is not going to happen.
Okay.
You
I
know,
know people are very concerned about that. I also don't think it's going to happen because otherwise that would truly be World War III. And I don't think anyone wants that.
the risks far outweigh the potential benefits. We wouldn't be able to send in enough troops. The Russian army has improved a lot. They kind of had some really tough times in the 90s, but one of the things Putin has done is really, modernize the force. They have a lot of really powerful weapons. I mean,
And they have
words come
nukes.
down to it.
And they have nukes. Why do we give men nuclear weapons? Is the real question that I have. No man is stable enough to have the power of a nuke, okay? Ted, I'm sure you would be fine with nukes, but I do not
I would
trust
be fine. I would just
anyone
use it.
else.
I think, yeah, it's like the big missile. Like every man wants to have his big missile, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Euphemism for everything, okay?
Yes, yes.
Truly a euphemism.
It's
Second thing
really
is,
sad.
speaking of nukes, they captured Chernobyl, and that's a big thing. First of all, they're like reenacting all this nuclear waste, all this radioactivity that's surrounding, and all these particles are flying.
Yeah.
Just so stupid. But
It's
what's the importance of them getting Chernobyl?
I don't really know. The one thing I would speculate is maybe they were concerned, maybe the Russians were concerned that the Ukrainians could somehow trigger or blow up Chernobyl in such a way that the fallout would go mainly towards Russia. I mean, it's right sort of near the border there with it's near the intersection of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. So maybe they thought there would be some kind of sabotage attempt or something. I mean, it doesn't really have much strategic value, it seems to me. I mean, I'm not a military.
Are there nuclear like facilities there? Are they still active? Do Russia have
Oh
more
no, it's
nukes?
not active. It's just a big. I mean, they built this big dome to enclose,
All the nuclear waste.
the nuclear
So mainly
waste.
more like symbolic type of thing rather than
Yeah, I think it's a largely
okay.
symbolic, and
Because
it's
people are
largely like
nervous.
yeah. And so Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons. So part of the reason the Ukrainians are so mad, honestly, is that there was something called the Budapest Agreement in the early
Right.
days following the Soviet collapse, where they agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. Like they're one of the few countries that had nuclear weapons, and they said, you know what, we don't really need these. We're going to get rid of them. We're peace-loving people. And there were some vaguely worded guarantees. No international lawyer will tell you that those Budapest agreements were binding and that they require the U.S. to intervene to protect Ukraine. But the Ukrainians interpreted it that way. At the time, it seemed to be that way. So now they feel really burned. I mean, would Putin have done this if they had a nuclear stockpile, which could severely hurt Russia? Probably not. And so I think they have a good point. It's also a sad thing because, who in the future is ever going to give up their nuclear weapons? If you give them up and then, a decade or 2 decades later, you get invaded by a country like Russia. It's really, that's another element of this that really, really, really sucks.
Really.
Because
Yeah. So
for those who would like nuclear non-proliferation or
yeah, first of all,
denuclearization.
I just feel like the entire world just needs a mom to be like, hand over the nukes. Like you do not deserve them right now. Okay. Just the
That's
entire
right.
world needs to be mommified. I feel like all we can do is just keep putting pressure on Russia, trying to sow distrust between the people and Putin, which I think is hopefully what we're doing with because I really think they're finally seeing the evil that he is capable of, you know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And moreover, I mean, I would add this too, like thinking a bit longer term. So one of the reasons I think the U.S. and others have balked at really pursuing that policies because the fear that whoever replaces Putin could be worse than Putin
Yeah.
in terms of being super nationalistic and super militaristic and just super nasty and scary on all dimensions. Well, now the prospect that someone who's even worse than Putin follows Putin is really diminished by
Right.
this experience. Just because I really, I really believe this, and I don't, I'm a social scientist. I believe in evidence, and but this is really, I don't think we don't know. We don't have evidence. I don't trust the polling coming out of the Russian. Even that polling today or recently has shown that the war is not popular. This is a game change. Like it's just everything else, all the other wars that Putin has fought, the small scale thing. This is different. This is really very different.
This is a abhorrent, like absolutely abhorrent thing that is going on right now. And do you have any other comments, any other statements?
I mean, I personally have just been in shock, and my emotions have run really high. She's deeply upsetting. I've studied these countries for 30 years. I've
Right.
traveled to both of them. I love them on some level, and it just pains me to see this level of just depravity, all because of one man and he and his greedy criminal friends who have really captured this entire nation of 140 million people, mainly Russia,
Right.
and a lot can happen, and we're not out of the woods. It could get a lot worse. Like Putin,
Yeah, we're
if he
recording this
really
on Friday. It's going to air on Monday, and there's so much that can happen in those 2 days.
so much that can happen, right? And it could end up. Maybe he'll decide he'll want to provoke even more. He'll attack Poland. He'll launch a tactical nuke. I mean, I don't think
We
it's
don't.
are likely, but I certainly wouldn't rule them out. And there's
Right.
really no telling, and that's very very frightening,
That's
given
really
the
scary.
amount, the arsenal that he has under his control.
Yeah, I think all we can do now from in America and across seas is encourage our governments to put as many sanctions as possible on Russia. Unfortunately, like Putin is sacrificing the better good of his own citizens for his own little egotistical maniac aggression,
Hmm.
because those sanctions are going to end up hurting the Russian people. They're not going to hurt him. And that's what I think is so upsetting about this. The UN
Because
is
yeah,
there's a massive refugee issue going on right now, massive refugee crisis of Ukrainians. Over 100,000 Ukrainians have already been displaced. There are going to be upwards of like 4 to 5 million being
yeah,
displaced.
there's going to be millions.
There's going to be
Absolutely.
millions and millions of people displaced. And I think all we can do is try to support those people as much as possible by giving donations, making sure that our government is putting sanctions on Russia, and then also supporting Russians that are fighting against Putin because they are also putting their lives at risk.
So it's two things. Yes, I mean supporting those Russians who are brave enough to oppose Putin, and it's also somehow reaching. I mean, part of the problem is that there are a lot of Russians who just don't have any access to any source of information other than the Kremlin line. My own pet theory is that this is really driven by Putin domestic concerns, and that's his ultimate goal. So we're going to see worse crackdowns, and so the U.S. has to find some way to reach the people of Russia to remind them that the reason why they're not able to pay their bills and they're losing their jobs and they can't afford to put food on the table is Putin. It's not the U.S. It's Putin. He is the one who bears responsibility for their suffering. So
Yeah.
they need to get rid of him because the U.S. I mean, short of like launching a missile to Kremlin, which probably won't work and could
It
lead
would
to
not be
lots of
good. We're all going to die if that happens.
no. I don't advocate that. I don't think that's.
Yeah.
I mean, if they could do like a covert kind of thing, but
If they could do
I
like
don't.
a 007 type of thing, like,
Yeah,
there's been worse things to happen, but
yeah, like
unfortunately,
a double guy in with one of
yeah,
those
just rides in the
hats.
motorcycle.
Right, right, yeah. But I
Where's
wouldn't count on
where's
that.
Daniel Craig when we need him is the real question. This is a really scary and a really sad situation, and unfortunately, it's
Yeah,
it sucks,
or,
and all
and
you
I
can do is
really
apply
feel
pressure to
more.
our governments to. I
That's
mean,
right.
I
And
personally would like to see them thrown out of SWIFT just because I think that'd probably be like the biggest sanction that they can do against them. I would also like to see the US. I saw Germany stop at the Nord track, which is the pipeline they were building with Russia for oil, which I think was a
yeah,
great move.
Nord Stream 2. Yes, yes,
Nord
that's
Stream
right. They
2.
stopped. Yeah.
Um, Nord track feels like a luge place, but
Yeah,
still
isn't
got
that one of
Olympics
those
on the mind.
cross country like Peloton
I
for
know,
cross
literally.
country?
Yeah, no, no. Nord Stream 2. There's a continue to pressure our government, continue to pressure the world to make sure that sanctions are put on Russia and that Russia feels the pain. And unfortunately, this is Putin's doing. This is all Putin.
Mm,
Remember, don't be racist to Russians because more or less, the
yes,
often is that they do not want this. People are not their governments. And
very
all we can
important
do
point.
is Just keep spreading the information about what's going on in Ukraine and supporting those people through monetary and information.
That's right, and we have to keep it on the agenda in the U.S. Like, you really
Absolutely.
worry that, okay, right now people are upset. There's they're seeing bombs fall, but you just feel that people will lose interest and they'll be more upset about inflation and go back to worrying about why. And so good for you running this series on this topic, and I hope
Thank
you
you.
and others will continue because yeah, we really need to keep informing Americans and keeping their attention on this. While we can't go and fight them, there's other things we can do, and we have to do them, even if they might cause us a little bit of pain. So I think that's the message we have to stick with. That this does matter. This affects us all. It'll affect our children, grandchildren, future generations.
Yeah. It's all about making sure that we use our power for the good and supporting people that need um,
That's right.
as most help
That's
as
right.
possible. So, anyways, I'm Emily. This has been kind of a shitty podcast just based on what is going on in the world, but Ted, you've been great.
Well,
I'm going
thanks.
to post a lot of links about where we can donate aid to Ukraine
Excellent.
to help
Excellent.
them as much as possible. But
Thanks
just
for
keep educating yourselves because remember, even though it's not in the news cycle, doesn't mean it's stopped happening. And that's
That's
really
right.
important to remember. But Ted, it's been great to have you, and thank you so much. And I'm Emily Gross, your host, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.